The dust in the small frontier town of Fort Willow, Wyoming Territory, settled uneasily, much like the mood inside the small clapboard church. It was late August, 1879, and the air was thick with the smell of dry sagebrush and anticipation. Clara Beaumont, barely 19, had just married Elias Vance, a man 10 years her senior and the owner of the largest, most isolated ranch in the valley, the Bar V. Clara wasn't a girl prone to flights of fancy or hysteria. She was the product of harsh prairie life, strong, quiet, and possessing eyes that held the relentless blue of a summer sky. Yet as she stood on the church steps, the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows across her white dress, a profound, chilling sense of dread settled over her. It was not the standard anxiety of a bride. It was the cold certainty that she was stepping into a cage. Elias was handsome in a severe, unyielding way. His dark suit was immaculate, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his handshake firm enough to bruise. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Everyone in Fort Willow respected Elias Vance. They respected his wealth and his solitude. They simply didn't know him. The reception was a modest affair in the town saloon. Whiskies flowed, fiddles scraped out lively tunes, and the small community offered their rough-hewn blessings. Clara's father, a grizzled rancher named Silas, pulled her aside, his face etched with concern under the flickering oil lamp. "Clara, honey," he rasped, his voice low. "You sure about this? The Vance Ranch? It's a long way out. Folks say he keeps to himself." Clara managed a faint smile, the effort costing her. "Pa, it's a good match, security, and I made a promise." The promise was a silent one, a vow to escape the grinding poverty of her family's struggling claim. At sundown, Elias led her to a small enclosed buggy. The silence during the ride was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the leather harness. The Bar V Ranch was nearly an hour outside of town, nestled deep in a small, arid canyon. As they drew closer, the landscape grew more desolate, the hills steeper and more unforgiving. The main house, a solid two-story structure of dark, unpainted wood, looked less like a home and more like a fortress. It was surrounded by a tall, rough-hewn wooden fence, unusual for a simple ranch. The air here was colder, the silence absolute. No dogs barked, no lanterns glowed besides the single dim one Elias carried. "Welcome home, Clara," Elias said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. The inside of the house was meticulously tidy, almost sterile. Heavy, dark furniture, no clutter, no personal touches. A sense of immense order, but no warmth. Elias showed her to their bedroom on the second floor. It was large, the windows draped with thick dark velvet curtains that blocked out the moon. "The key to the house," Elias said, placing a heavy iron key on the bedside table. "Only I carry it. The prairie can be cruel, best to be secure." He gave her a tight, possessive smile. "You are my wife now, Clara. What is mine, stays mine." Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone with him, miles from anyone. The next morning, the sun rose over Fort Willow, and the town began its slow, dusty day. Silas and his wife Martha waited patiently for the young couple to arrive for a traditional post-wedding breakfast. An hour passed, then two. It was impolite, but not alarming. The Vance Ranch was a long ride. By noon, Martha began to fret. "Silas, something's wrong. Elias would never be this late. He's too punctual." Silas mounted his horse, assuring his wife he was just going to check on the newlyweds. He rode the familiar, arduous path to the Bar V. He expected to see Elias's hired hands moving cattle or smoke rising from the chimney. He saw nothing. The fence gate was bolted shut. He dismounted and forced it open. The ranch yard was eerily quiet. The barn doors were closed. No horses were in the corral. He pounded on the front door of the main house. "Elias, Clara, are you there?" Silence. He tried the door handle. Locked. He moved to a side window, cupped his hands against the glass, and peered inside. The dining room was spotless. The table was set for breakfast. 2 plates, silverware, a pitcher of water, as though waiting. But no one was there. A growing knot of panic tightened in Silas's chest. He knew his daughter. She would never run off, especially not without a word, and certainly not abandoning her wedding dress and dowry items, which he knew were inside. Silas found a spare axe by the woodshed and, with a desperate strength, smashed the lock on the front door. Inside the house was a tomb. He checked the kitchen. Empty. The sitting room. Empty. Finally, he reached the master bedroom upstairs. The room was neat. The bed was made, or rather the covers were pulled up and smoothed, pristine. It looked unused. On the floor beside the bed, however, was a faint, dark smear on the floorboard, small and almost invisible, quickly cleaned up. And on the bedside table, beside the iron key Elias had shown her, was a small, delicate silver locket, a gift from Clara's mother. It was open. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of Clara and one of Silas, but there was no Clara, no Elias, no one. Silas ran to the window and threw back the thick curtains, letting in the blinding afternoon sun. He looked out over the vast, desolate prairie surrounding the Bar V ranch. It stretched for miles, silent and indifferent. His daughter had vanished. After her wedding night, the house was empty. The silence that had greeted him was a chilling, absolute void where human life should have been. The only evidence left behind was a small, faint stain on the floor and an open locket, a quiet plea. The terrifying realization hit Silas. The danger wasn't on the prairie, it was inside the Bar V walls. And now, both the predator and the prey were gone. The mystery had just begun. If you're gripped by the chilling mystery of Clara's disappearance, don't miss the next chapter. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow this story. The broken door to the Bar V house stood as an ominous, jagged mouth, screaming the silent horror Silas had just discovered. He stood in the middle of the spotless master bedroom, the small, dark smear on the floorboards a burning accusation in his mind. The prairie air, once a source of comfort, now pressed in on him, heavy and hostile. Silas didn't waste time on hysteria. He was a man of action forged by the frontier. He rode back to Fort Willow with a desperate urgency, the single iron key Elias had left behind clutched in his hand. The key was cold, heavy, and utterly useless now. Back in town, the news of the empty house spread like a flash fire on dry grass. Elias Vance was rich, but not well liked. His isolation had bred suspicion, but never outright fear, until now. Sheriff Homer Reed, a stout, slow-moving man who had spent his career settling cattle disputes, was immediately overwhelmed. "They just left Silas?" Sheriff Reed asked, skepticism thick in his voice as he stood in the dust of the Vance yard an hour later, surrounded by a hastily assembled posse of 5 ranchers. "Maybe they rode into the next county for a secret honeymoon. Elias is an odd bird. Look at the place, Homer." Silas gestured wildly at the sealed windows and the bolted gate. "Does this look like someone leaving for a honeymoon? The bed's not even slept in. And Clara's locket, she never took that off." The small smear of red-brown on the floor, now examined by daylight, was undeniably blood, though a small amount. "Could be a cut," the sheriff muttered, unconvinced. "Shaving accident, maybe." "And the Vances? Where are they?" Silas challenged. The ensuing search was haphazard and poorly organized, limited by the vastness of the territory. They tracked the only hoof prints leading away from the house, those of a single rider, Elias Vance, traveling west toward the more rugged mountains. There were no buggy tracks, no tracks of a second horse. Elias had ridden out alone. The immediate conclusion, fueled by gossip and frontier justice, was inescapable. Elias Vance had murdered his new wife on their wedding night and fled. For the next 3 days, the posse scoured the canyons and foothills. They found nothing. The only thing they did find was a hired hand, Jedediah, who worked the northern section of the Bar V and lived in a small cabin miles away. Jedediah, a quiet man with dull eyes, confirmed that he hadn't seen Elias or Clara since the wedding, and that Elias had given him a month's wages and a note saying he was traveling north on urgent business late the night of the wedding. Did he mention his wife? Sheriff Reed asked, scribbling in his small ledger. Jedediah shook his head slowly. Didn't mention her at all, Sheriff, just that I was to keep the cattle going and mind my own business. Said he'd send word when he was back. This detail, Elias riding out alone and calmly instructing a ranch hand, complicated the simple murder theory. If he had just committed a bloody crime, why the calculated instruction? Where was Clara? The focus shifted from a simple runaway murderer to a bizarre, premeditated disappearance. Silas, however, refused to accept the official theory that Elias had disposed of the body somewhere in the wilderness and was now long gone. Silas began his own investigation, focusing on the house, the place of the last known silence. He couldn't shake the feeling of intense order in the Vance residence. He returned to the Bar V daily. He spent hours in the bedroom staring at the clean, white spread. He paced the hall. He noticed small things the sheriff's men had missed. In the parlor, a large antique clock stood on the mantelpiece. It was a beautiful piece, but it hadn't chimed since Silas's first arrival. He opened the glass face. The pendulum was still. The clock was fully wound, but someone had deliberately locked the mechanism with a tiny, nearly invisible brass pin. Why stop a clock? Downstairs in Elias's small, heavily stocked library, a collection of dry law books and agricultural manuals, Silas noticed a faint scraping on the hardwood floor behind a large, immovable oak desk. He shoved the desk violently, revealing a section of the floor that was fractionally newer and lighter than the rest. He pried it up with a pocket knife. Beneath it, nestled in the dirt crawl space, was a small, locked wooden box. Silas's hands shook as he used the axe to smash the box open. Inside were 3 items. 1. A small, handwritten, leather-bound diary, not Elias's handwriting. 2. A single, perfectly preserved, faded yellow ribbon. 3. A set of detailed architectural blueprints for the Bar V house. The diary was the most compelling. It was dated 12 years prior, 1867, and belonged to a woman named Eliza. The entries were erratic and increasingly desperate. June 12, 1867. He bought me this locket. He says I must be quiet. I will be quiet. He loves order. August 18th, 1867. The walls feel so close. I told him I needed to see the sky. He said the sky is dangerous. He locked the doors downstairs tonight. August 26th, 1867. It's been a week since I spoke to anyone but him. I hate the way the curtains are always drawn. I told him I feel like I'm disappearing. He laughed. The last entry, chillingly, was dated August 29th, 1867, exactly 12 years to the day before Clara's wedding. August 29th, 1867. It is silence now. He says I chose it. I didn't. I think he will. The sentence ended abruptly, the ink smeared as if the pen had been snatched away. Silas looked up from the diary, his eyes wide with a cold, terrifying clarity. Elias hadn't just murdered Clara in a fit of rage and fled. This was a pattern. This house, the Bar V, wasn't just a ranch, it was a carefully constructed mechanism designed to isolate and eliminate. Clara was not the first. He rushed back to the bedroom upstairs, clutching Eliza's diary and the blueprints. He threw the papers onto the bed and began to pore over the floor plan. The blueprints were meticulous, showing the standard layout. But on the second floor, a specific detail stood out. A small, unlabeled, rectangular area marked Storage, Access Restricted, adjacent to the master bedroom, the entrance to which was not shown on the plans. It was an area the sheriff had likely dismissed as part of the chimney stack or a closet. Silas ran his hand over the wall of the master bedroom where the restricted area was indicated. It was a blank wall, covered by thick, ornate wallpaper. He tapped it. A dead, hollow sound. He realized Elias hadn't fled because he was guilty. He had fled because his carefully constructed silence had been broken. And somewhere, in the walls of the Bar V, lay the terrible truth of not one, but possibly two, disappeared women. The mystery was no longer where Elias went, but what he did, and where he kept his secrets. The suspense, thick and stifling, now centered entirely on the dark wood and stone of the silent house. The discovery of Eliza's diary and the anomalous architectural plans transformed the investigation from a simple search for a runaway killer into an unnerving excavation of a 12-year-old secret. Silas immediately brought the items to Sheriff Reed, who was initially skeptical but whose eyes widened with growing dread as he read the final smeared entry. "This is madness, Silas," the sheriff whispered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "A hidden room? On the Bar V. We searched that place top to bottom." "You searched what you saw," Silas countered, his voice steady with cold resolve. "Elias Vance didn't leave because he was scared. He left because he was finished with his work. This isn't a murder, Homer. It's an established ritual." Armed with the information from the blueprints, Silas, Sheriff Reed, and 2 deputies returned to the Bar V. The tension in the house was palpable. Even the seasoned deputies felt the chill that emanated from the dark wood and closed-up atmosphere. In the master bedroom, Silas directed them to the wallpapered section next to the fireplace chimney, exactly where the access-restricted area was marked. The wall looked solid, perfectly aligned with the plasterwork of the room. "It's just the chimney breast, Silas," Deputy Bennett argued, tapping the solid brickwork near the floor. "Higher up," Silas insisted, pointing to the seam between the wallpaper and the picture rail. "Look at the pattern. It's almost perfectly matched, but there's a faint vertical line here, about 6 feet up." Sheriff Reed took a lantern and held it close. The seam was barely visible, camouflaged with meticulous precision. He used his pocket knife to carefully score the paper along the line. It revealed a tiny vertical gap, a door so expertly hidden it appeared to be part of the solid wall. They tried to force it open, but it was sealed tight. Silas consulted the blueprints again. "The latch isn't on the outside. It's held from within, or by a complex internal mechanism." After an hour of careful, silent work, the only sound the frantic hammering of their own hearts, they managed to pry open a small gap near the bottom of the seam. Using a crowbar, they exerted all their strength. With a horrifying grinding sound of displaced wood and stone, the section of the wall swung inward like a heavy gate, revealing a pitch-black cavity. The smell that wafted out was the first wave of true horror. A dry, musty odor, like old earth and decay, mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness. Sheriff Reed held his lantern into the space. It wasn't large, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, a crude, unventilated chamber carved out between the chimney and the outer wall. What they saw was not a bloody scene of recent violence, but something far more psychologically unsettling. The walls were rough, unfinished stone. In the center of the room sat a single, narrow, iron-framed bed, covered by a threadbare blanket. On the bed lay a bundle of clothes, faded cotton dresses from a bygone style, the same era as Eliza's diary. On the small, dusty floor were stacks of pages, hundreds of them, all filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting. And on the corner of the small bed, resting against the stone wall, was a human skull. It was clean, dry, and bleached white. A stark, terrifying sculpture in the oppressive silence. A single faded yellow ribbon, identical to the one found in the hidden box, was tied carefully around its temporal bone. Silas staggered back, his breath catching in a choked sob. "Eliza," he whispered. It was Eliza. The deputies quickly examined the papers. They were the remainder of Eliza's diary, her thoughts spilling onto hundreds of loose sheets over what must have been months or years of confinement. The handwriting began neat, growing more frantic, then smaller, more repetitive, and finally looping into bizarre, nonsensical patterns. The psychological breakdown of a woman isolated to the point of madness was documented with horrifying detail. Sample entry, undated, late in the sequence. He says I must be the silence. He came today. He brought water. He says the outside is loud. I like the dark better now. I am the silence. I am the clean space. The skull, the bed, the writings, it painted a picture of confinement, mental torture, and eventual death by starvation or despair, not sudden, violent murder. Elias Vance wasn't a rampaging killer. He was a collector of silence, a meticulous, terrifying psychopath who sought to erase the very existence of his victims. Sheriff Reed, visibly shaken, pointed his lantern at the ceiling. If this was Eliza, what about Clara? The chamber was entirely too small to have held two victims, and the single set of clothes belonged to Eliza's era. Clara had only been gone for less than 48 hours. Silas noticed something else, something the light had missed upon initial entry. On the back of the heavy, swinging door, carved crudely into the wood, was a series of markings. They were not words, but simple tally-like symbols, 10 of them grouped in pairs. Deputy Bennett looked closer. Looks like a calendar, maybe? 10 weeks? Silas shook his head, his eyes narrowed, an icy realization forming. No. Look at the top mark. It's a single, deep line. Look at the last mark. The last mark was still incomplete, just a scratch. These aren't weeks. They're people. The hidden room, then, was not where Clara had been taken. It was a macabre monument, a record of Elias's deadly obsession with forced isolation and disappearance. And the tally mark was a chilling, premeditated plan. The 10th mark, unfinished, suggested Clara was the 10th subject in Elias's horrifying experiment in psychological erasure. The discovery gave them a terrible, definitive answer to the question of why Elias had left, and a new, urgent question to replace it. Where had he started his final experiment with Clara? The suspense now centered on the idea that Clara was still alive, confined somewhere, undergoing the early stages of Elias's slow psychological torture. They had to find her before her mind broke like Eliza's. The grim discovery in the hidden room galvanized the community into an organized, frantic effort. Clara, the ranch girl, was no longer a statistic in a runaway case. She was a victim of a terrifying, methodical predator. The fear was now a sharp, focused terror. Elias Vance wasn't running. He was enacting a horrific long-term plan. Silas, armed with the evidence of Elias's meticulous, obsessive nature, focused on the logic of the house. A man who stopped a clock to control time, who built a hidden mausoleum, would not act randomly. He would have a method, a system. He wants silence, Homer, Silas explained to the sheriff back in town, pointing at Eliza's scrawled notes. He doesn't want noise, clutter, or resistance. The Bar V is his controlled laboratory. If Clara is here, she is in a place that fits his cruel symmetry. They revisited the Bar V with fresh eyes, searching for a place that screamed controlled isolation more than the main house itself. The search moved outside, away from the fortress-like residence, but still within the protective perimeter of the high wooden fence. The ranch contained a barn, a large woodshed, and a deep well. The barn was ruled out. It was too open, too noisy with livestock. The woodshed, while small, was constantly used and exposed to light. Silas turned his attention to the well. It was an unusually deep, stone-lined structure, situated 50 yards from the back door. It was covered by a heavy, hinged wooden lid, kept latched with a strong padlock. "Why the padlock on the well?" Silas asked one of the deputies. "Is there something valuable down there besides water?" "Just to keep the coyotes out, Silas. It's deep," the deputy replied. Silas approached the well. The iron ring to lift the bucket was coated in dust, seemingly unused for a while. He noted the padlock, new, shiny, unlike the old rusted locks on the barn and shed, and the stone lining around the top was remarkably clean, recently repointed with fresh mortar. Sheriff Reed used an iron bar to snap the new padlock. They lifted the heavy wooden lid. The smell of cold, clean water rose up. They lowered a lantern slowly. The shaft was indeed deep, perhaps 40 feet to the waterline. The light danced off the black, reflective surface. No sign of Clara. Silas, however, noticed that the stone lining seemed to change texture and color about 15 feet down. It transitioned from rough, naturally weathered stone to a series of uniform cut blocks. He remembered the blueprints of the house, the detail, the precision. "Lower me down," Silas commanded, grabbing a rope. "There's a landing. I know it." Reluctantly, Sheriff Reed and the deputies began to lower Silas into the dark, damp shaft. The air grew colder, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of the rope. At 15 feet, Silas found what he was looking for. The cut stone blocks formed a solid, circular platform, about 3 feet wide, surrounding the main shaft. And on the side facing the house, a heavy, iron-bound wooden door was set into the well's wall. It was perfectly camouflaged to look like the rest of the lining from above. Silas signaled to be lowered to the platform. He landed with a soft thud. The door had no handle, only a small brass lever tucked into the stone seam. He gripped the lever, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was cold, metallic, and utterly final. He pulled the lever. A heavy, sickening clunk echoed up the shaft. The door creaked open, revealing a passage cut horizontally into the dry earth. The air that flowed out was still, dry and faintly metallic, not the smell of decay, but of dust and confined living. "I'm in!" Silas yelled up the shaft, his voice muffled by the deep stone. "Homer, get down here, bring the other lantern." The tunnel was narrow and short, leading after about 20 feet into a small, dry, subterranean room, dug deep into the bedrock. This was Elias's true lair of isolation. The room was Spartan, even more so than the main house. A single pallet on the floor, a bucket for waste, and a small jug of water. In the corner sat a pile of neatly folded blankets, and on the pallet, curled up on her side, wearing the same clothes she'd worn on her wedding night, was Clara. She wasn't dead, but as the lamplight hit her, Silas saw something worse than a physical wound. Her eyes were open, staring at the stone wall. They were utterly flat, devoid of focus, like 2 chips of prairie glass. She didn't react to the light, the sound of the door opening, or the sound of his ragged breathing. She was alive, but the silence had already begun its work. "Clara, my girl, oh God, Clara!" Silas rushed to her, pulling her into a desperate embrace. She didn't move. Her body was stiff, unresponsive. Her lips didn't part. Her gaze remained fixed on the stone. Sheriff Reed and the deputies scrambled into the room. They checked her pulse, steady, if weak. She had food and water, but she hadn't consumed much. "She's in shock, Silas," the sheriff said grimly. "Or worse, he's broken her mind." As they prepared to bring her up, Silas noticed a final, terrifying detail. Tucked under her arm, clutched tightly even in her catatonic state, was a small, crudely drawn charcoal sketch. It depicted a series of concentric circles meticulously drawn. In the very center, a single black dot. And around the edges, faint lines radiating outwards as if something was trying desperately to escape the center. It was a map of her own dissolving mind. Elias hadn't killed her. He had imprisoned her in a space of such absolute sensory deprivation that her mind had retreated into itself. The silence was complete. The suspense was no longer about where she was, but if they could bring her back from the abyss Elias had engineered. The grim, silent figure of Clara was rushed back to Fort Willow and placed in the care of Martha and the town doctor, a grizzled man named Doc Evans. Her physical needs were simple: hydration, warmth, and nourishment. Her mental state, however, was a deep, horrifying mystery that Doc Evans confessed was beyond his frontier medicine. She remained locked in a catatonic state, responding to nothing. Silas stayed by her side, the image of the hidden room and Eliza's skull burning in his memory. He knew the key to bringing Clara back, if it was possible at all, lay not in medicine, but in understanding Elias Vance. The sheriff's men, while continuing the futile search for Elias, focused on the Bar V, cataloguing the psychopath's calculated environment. They found evidence of Elias's meticulous preparations for Clara's confinement. The room's exit, the tunnel to the well, was soundproofed on the interior with heavy padding. He had left her a small clock, deliberately stopped, like the one in the parlor, to eliminate the sense of passing time. Elias was revealed to be an architect of silence, a man obsessed with control through sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. His goal wasn't just to murder, but to erase the identity of his victims, leaving behind only the vessel of the human being, the clean space Eliza had written about. The investigation into Elias's past intensified. The sheriff sent telegrams across the territory. The response, slow in coming, was a chilling confirmation of Silas's fears about the 10 tally marks. Elias Vance was not his birth name. He had operated under at least 3 different aliases in 3 different frontier towns over the past 15 years: Albert Voss, Elijah Hayes, and Edgar Vane. In each town, a young woman, all of a similar age and disposition to Clara and Eliza, had disappeared shortly after entering into a close relationship with him. The disappearances were always attributed to runaway spouses or accidents in the harsh wilderness. The tally of confirmed vanished women now stood at 7. Clara was the 8th known subject, the yellow ribbon. The key link across the cases was a single disturbing pattern. The family of Albert Voss's first known victim, a girl named Amelia, reported that the last item she had been seen wearing was a distinctive yellow ribbon, the same ribbon found with Eliza's skull and in Elias's locked box. Elias didn't just confine them, he stripped away their identity and left a specific, macabre signature item behind, a trophy of their psychological erasure. The discovery of the pattern only deepened the suspense regarding Clara. If 8 women had vanished or were confirmed dead, and the hidden room suggested the process was long and torturous, how had Clara survived only 2 days in the hole? Elias had fled too soon. He was interrupted, Silas stated, staring at his daughter's lifeless face. He panicked. But why? He's a machine. He's calculating. What could break his control? Silas returned to the scene of the crime, the master bedroom. The bed, the curtains, the faint blood smear. He analyzed every detail, looking for the disruption that had forced Elias's premature retreat. He found it in the dust. Elias was obsessive about cleanliness. The house was spotless, yet in the small space between the headboard of the bed and the wall, Silas noticed a slight, horizontal disturbance in the dust. A thin, almost invisible streak. It was too high to be caused by a broom and too far back to be caused by someone making the bed. It suggested something thin and flat had been aggressively pulled from between the headboard and the wall. He pulled the heavy headboard away, straining his back. Behind it, wedged into the gap, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to Elias Vance, postmarked from Denver 3 days before the wedding. The handwriting was neat and formal. It was a legal notification. Mr. Vance, we represent the estate of Miss Amelia Cross, D. 1864. New evidence in the disappearance of Miss Cross has led to the reopening of the case. Witnesses place you near the location of her last sighting, and your subsequent unexplained relocation is of interest. You are hereby ordered to appear before the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office on September 5th, 1879, to answer questions regarding your identity and knowledge of the deceased. The date of the summons, September 5th. Clara's wedding night, August 29th. The day Elias fled, August 30th. Elias had received the letter before the wedding. He had gone through the ceremony, brought Clara home, and started the terrible process of her confinement. But the deadline of September 5th loomed. Elias had been compromised. He wasn't running from the local sheriff, but from the authorities in Denver who were connecting his past crimes. He had to flee the territory before the summons arrived in Fort Willow. Elias's meticulous, fragile control had been shattered by the one thing he couldn't control, the persistence of the past. He had initiated Clara's terrifying psychological descent, but was forced to abandon his victim before the silence was complete. The question of why he fled was solved. The urgent question now was how to use this knowledge. Elias was a creature of habit. He had been forced to abandon his lair, but he would not abandon his method. He was running, but his mind was still focused on his obsession. The key to finding him, and perhaps saving Clara, lay in predicting his next desperate act of control. The discovery of the Denver summons was a relief and a burden. It explained Elias's hurried departure, confirming that he had fled out of fear of exposure, not because his plan with Clara was complete. The focus immediately shifted from a local search to an interterritorial manhunt, but Silas knew the police would fail unless they tracked the mind of Elias Vance. Silas sat with Sheriff Reed and Doc Evans, poring over the maps and the fragments of Elias's life. The Bar V was a complete system of control, a physical manifestation of Elias's psychopathy. He can't just kill, Silas theorized, tracing a finger along the mountain passes on the map. He has to engineer the disappearance. The control is everything. The lack of control is what made him run. He won't stop until he rebuilds his laboratory. The key was the method. Elias's victims were always 1. Young women in isolated settings. 2. Recently married or deeply attached to him. 3. Confined to a space designed for sensory deprivation. 4. Left with a yellow ribbon as a token of their lost identity. The map showed Elias's probable direction, west toward the rugged, unorganized territory of Utah, where he could easily lose himself and start a new identity. But starting a new ranch, a new Bar V, was a long, complex project. Elias needed an interim solution. He's not going to build a new house, Doc Evans mused, wiping his spectacles. Not quickly enough. He needs a ready-made place of isolation, something overlooked, out of the way, but solid. Silas stared at the map of the surrounding territory. Scattered across the vast, lonely plains were the skeletal remains of past dreams. Abandoned stagecoach relay stations, failed mining claims, and the occasional empty homestead. The relay stations, Silas said, tapping a point 60 miles west on an old, forgotten freight route that paralleled Elias's hoofprints. They're built like small fortresses, stone-lined, often with a deep cellar or cistern for water. They're isolated and no one would look there now that the new line is active. The most promising candidate was the Dry Creek Relay, a station abandoned nearly a decade ago after the water source dried up. It was notorious for its extreme isolation and the deep, solid construction of its main stone building designed to withstand bandit attacks. Sheriff Reed, though wary of chasing a psychological ghost, agreed the logic was sound. He organized a small, fast-moving team of 4, including Silas, to ride out to the Dry Creek Relay. The ride was grueling, taking over a day. When they arrived, the relay was exactly as described, a squat, single-story stone structure, silent and weathering in the high desert wind. The air here was even colder than at the Bar V, the silence more profound. They found signs of recent activity, faint, newly made tire tracks of a wagon, not just a horse. Elias had taken a wagon. Why? The building itself was locked with a heavy chain and a padlock, a new one, identical to the one on the Bar V well. Sheriff Reed cut it quickly. Inside, the relay was mostly an empty shell, dusty and cold. The kitchen, the common room, the stables, all empty. But in the back corner of the common room, a large, heavy rug was laid over the stone floor, out of place in such a desolate structure. They rolled back the rug, revealing a square trap door, also new and tightly sealed. "He's done it again," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a mixture of terror and grim confirmation. "He's found his new cellar, his new laboratory." Using a crowbar, they forced the door open. A deep, cold, earthy smell rose up. They lowered a lantern. The light revealed a stone staircase descending into a small, dry cistern, perhaps 10 feet deep. At the bottom of the cistern, the stone floor had been covered with fresh hay. Lying on the hay was a woman. She was young, with dark hair, wearing a simple, sturdy dress. She was awake, her back against the cold stone wall, staring blankly up at the light. But it wasn't Clara. The woman was entirely a stranger to Silas. She was thin, covered in dust, and her expression held the same terrifying blankness as Clara's. She held her arms protectively around her knees, and her face was wet with dried tears. "Who are you, ma'am?" the sheriff asked gently, descending into the cistern. The woman simply stared at the sheriff, her lips moving without sound. She pointed a trembling finger at her chest, her eyes wide with terror. But she spoke no word. On her collar, pinned carefully to the fabric, was a small, faded yellow ribbon. Elias had been forced to abandon Clara, but he hadn't stopped. He had found a new, immediate victim on his flight west, a new subject to fill the gap in his ritual. He had acted with astonishing speed to restore his control. The terror was that this man was a force of nature, an unstoppable engine of psychological destruction. He had already claimed his 9th victim. The suspense was now not only about capturing Elias, but about the terrifying possibility that he was building toward the final 10th stage of his ultimate ritual. The discovery of the 9th victim, a woman later identified as Mary Jenkins, a traveling seamstress who had vanished from a nearby settlement, was a crushing blow. Elias Vance was not simply a predator. He was a serial manipulator with a frightening speed and efficiency. He had secured a new victim within a day of fleeing the Bar V. Mary was in a state similar to Clara's, deeply withdrawn, though not completely catatonic. She responded to touch with a sharp flinch, and while she wouldn't speak, her eyes darted nervously, tracking every movement. Doc Evans explained that the longer a person was subjected to sensory deprivation, the faster the decline. Elias's premature departure from the Bar V had saved Clara, but he had perfected the technique on Mary. The search party quickly pressed on, now trailing a full posse from the nearest large town. Silas, however, knew brute force wouldn't find Elias. They needed the thread of his obsession. Back at Fort Willow, while Clara lay in her quiet room, Silas focused on the only thing Elias had left behind that wasn't a structure of confinement: the tally marks. He revisited the photograph of the crude carvings on the inner door of Eliza's hidden room. 10 symbols, 1 incomplete. Eliza, first known case, 1867. Amelia, Denver case, 1864. Disappearance. 7 others: Voss, Hayes, Vane aliases. Clara, subject 8. Mary, subject 9. The tally was a countdown to a horrific finality. The 10th mark, the incomplete one, suggested a planned ultimate victim. "He's not just collecting victims, Homer," Silas told the sheriff. "He's building to a finale. 10 is a perfect number, a complete circle for a man who loves control. He's trying to close the chapter on his life before he's caught. If the 10th victim was planned, then who was she? Elias always targeted women who were isolated and attached to him. But he was now a fugitive, rushing across hostile territory. Who could he possibly secure as a 10th victim while running for his life? Silas remembered a detail from the initial wedding day. Elias Vance's one close acquaintance, the only person he was known to rely on. The ranch foreman at the Bar V, Jedediah. Jedediah was the one Elias had calmly paid and instructed to mind the cattle. He was the only person Elias truly trusted. A man who kept to himself, worked hard, and was loyal to his employer. Jedediah isn't married, the sheriff pointed out. He lives alone in that shack miles away. He's not the victim, Homer, Silas said, the chilling realization dawning on him. He's the key to the 10th victim. Elias needs two things for his ritual, a secluded place and a woman who can be isolated. He can't run the Bar V. He needs an enabler. Silas ordered a deputy to ride back to the Bar V immediately and check Jedediah's isolated shack. The report came back a day later. Jedediah was gone. His meager belongings were packed. His pay was untouched. The deputy found a single scorched letter in Jedediah's fire pit, partially readable. "Meet me at the canyon. Bring your sister. She must be alone." Jedediah had a sister, Sarah, who lived in a small, isolated cabin near a remote canyon 40 miles north of the Dry Creek Relay, directly on the path Elias was taking toward Utah. Sarah Jenkins was a widow, living alone, known for her shyness and isolation, a perfect target profile. Jedediah, loyal and possibly manipulated by Elias, was bringing his own sister to the psychopath. This was the final, desperate act. The use of a Confederate to secure the 10th, ultimate victim before disappearing into the Badlands forever. The suspense was no longer a matter of search, but a direct, brutal race against time. Silas and the posse changed course, riding north, their horses straining against the relentless pace. They reached the remote canyon just as the sun began to set, painting the jagged rocks in hues of blood orange and deep violet. They found Jedediah's horse tied to a stunted juniper tree near a shallow cave entrance. Inside, the light was dim and smoky. Elias Vance, his face grim and dusted, was in the process of securing a heavy, iron grate over the mouth of a deeper natural crevice in the cave floor, a ready-made confinement chamber. Jedediah stood guard, a rifle pointed uncertainly at the cave entrance. Sarah was huddled inside the dark crevice, already isolated and terrified, but still fighting, her muffled sobs echoing up. "Jedediah, drop the rifle!" Sheriff Reed bellowed, his own rifle raised. Jedediah hesitated, his simple face torn between loyalty to his employer and the horrifying reality before him. "He said she's not well, Sheriff, that she needs quiet," Jedediah stammered. "He was taking care of her." "He killed 8 women before this, Jedediah," Silas screamed, the years of repressed terror bursting forth. "He will kill your sister too. Look at what you've done." The confusion created the opening. The confrontation was immediate and violent. Elias, seeing his final ritual interrupted, made a desperate move to seal the grate. Jedediah, finally understanding, turned his rifle on Elias. The suspense had reached its brutal climax, the fate of the 10th victim hanging on the final chaotic confrontation in the dark of the remote canyon cave. The terrifying end of Elias Vance's ritual is coming. If you've followed Clara and Silas this far, you don't want to miss the final chapters. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow the dramatic conclusion. The cavern exploded into chaos. The sounds of the struggle, the shouts, the frantic scraping of the iron grate, and the sudden deafening crack of a rifle shot shattered the canyon's silence. Jedediah's sudden realization had caused him to pivot, aiming his old rifle not at the posse, but at Elias Vance. However, Jedediah was a ranch hand, not a fighter. His shot went wide, ricocheting off the cave wall and showering sparks. Elias, momentarily distracted by the betrayal, lunged. He was a powerfully built man driven by manic control. He didn't use a gun. He preferred the controlled silence of his methods. He grabbed a heavy rock from the cave floor and swung it, catching Jedediah brutally on the side of the head. Jedediah crumpled, the rifle clattering uselessly. Elias turned back to the grate, his eyes wild with desperate focus. Sarah's terrified shrieks were the only sound coming from the crevice now. Elias was inches from dropping the heavy crossbar and sealing his final 10th victim into the cold, black earth. Sheriff Reed fired 2 quick shots into the roof of the cave as a distraction, forcing Elias to momentarily duck. Silas, driven by the memory of Clara's blank stare and Eliza's skull, didn't hesitate. He was a rancher, not a lawman, but his desperation lent him a terrible, cold strength. He ran straight at Elias, tackling him low and hard, sending both men skidding across the dusty stone floor. They grappled violently. Elias was stronger, fueled by his need for completion. He landed a blow to Silas's jaw, staggering him. But Silas held on, his focus solely on the heavy grate. He shoved Elias backward toward the deep, shadowed mouth of the cave. Elias tried to pull a knife, but Silas slammed his elbow down, pinning Elias's wrist to the ground. "You won't have her, Elias," Silas snarled, his voice hoarse. "You won't finish it. You lost control." The mention of control was a psychological key. Elias's eyes widened, not with pain, but with a terrifying, frustrated rage. He needed the silence. He needed the perfect 10. He kicked Silas away, scrambled to his feet, and instead of running, he did the unthinkable. He grabbed the heavy iron grate and heaved it over the crevice entrance, dropping the thick crossbar into place. Sarah was sealed inside. Elias stood over the sealed grate, breathing heavily, a terrifying, triumphant look of completion on his face. The muffled sobs from the crevice provided the final, soft sound of his victory. "Silence," Elias gasped, wiping dust from his eyes. "It is finished." The sheriff and the deputies moved in instantly. Elias, having achieved his horrific finality, offered no resistance. He stood calmly, the picture of a man who had completed a difficult task. The posse worked frantically to free Sarah. With the collective strength of 4 men, they eventually managed to pry the crossbar free and haul the heavy grate open. Sarah Jenkins, the 10th intended victim, stumbled out, alive and physically unharmed, but on the very edge of the abyss of psychological terror. She was taken away by 2 deputies, screaming hysterically, a healthy, vital noise that was the antithesis of Elias's obsession. Elias Vance was bound and taken back toward Fort Willow. The immediate terror was over. The architect of silence was captured, but the profound psychological horror remained. The cave was his final, crude laboratory. On the wall, above the crevice, Elias had found a piece of charcoal and had completed the final, 10th tally mark. It was a deep, definitive line, standing apart from the others. The next few days were consumed by the grim logistics, transporting Elias, treating Sarah, and returning to the Bar V to collect the devastating evidence, including Eliza's remains. Silas, exhausted but resolute, returned to Clara's bedside in Fort Willow. She was physically recovering, but her mind remained a fortress of silence. Doc Evans had given up hope, suggesting she might never speak or move again. Silas refused to believe it. He knew the source of her trauma, the loss of control, the isolation, the sensory deprivation. He pulled a chair close to her bed. He placed his hand on hers, which was cold and unresponsive. He didn't talk about the ranch, the cave, or Elias. He talked about noise, life, and connection, the things Elias had systematically stripped away. He described the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of the cattle, the squeak of the windmill, the warmth of the cook stove, the crunch of boots on the gravel. He spoke of Martha's singing, the laughter of the neighbors, the chaos of the 4th of July picnic. He flooded the sterile silence of her room with vivid, authentic images of the life she had been stolen from. He talked for hours, relentlessly. On the 3rd day, as he described the scent of the sagebrush and the sound of the prairie wind, something shifted. Clara's lips, thin and dry, moved almost imperceptibly. Silas leaned closer, his heart seizing in his chest. She whispered a single cracked word, her voice barely a breath. Loud. It was a sign. A connection between her confinement and the life he was describing. Elias had told his victims the outside was loud and dangerous. Clara was acknowledging the external world, even if through the filter of her trauma. The horrifying suspense was replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. Clara was fighting to come back, but the scars of the Bar V were deep. The whispered word, loud, was the first break in the fortress of Clara's mind. It was a flicker of resistance, a sign that the real Clara was still fighting the psychological control Elias had imposed. Silas seized on it. He understood that Elias's method was to convince his victims that the world outside was dangerous and chaotic, and that his silence was their only safety. Silas's new mission was one of psychological counter-programming. He sat with Clara, not seeking conversation, but systematically assaulting the silence and order Elias had imposed. He brought in a battered, out-of-tune fiddle and played rough, joyful, loud folk songs. He brought in small, colorful wildflowers, disrupting the room's plain color palette. He spoke continuously, not in hushed tones, but in a strong, steady voice, describing the disorder and vitality of the world. A rainstorm that flooded the creek, a calf that broke its leg, the loud, messy argument the sheriff had with the judge over the transport of Elias Vance. Clara's progress was agonizingly slow. Her eyes began to track Silas, her fingers twitching. She still wouldn't move, but she was listening, processing. The internal struggle was visible in the minute movements of her face. Meanwhile, the formal investigation into Elias Vance began. The authorities from Denver, including an agent named Mr. Thomas, arrived in Fort Willow. They brought with them the full scope of Elias's crimes across the territories. Elias, completely calm after his capture, was utterly silent, refusing to speak a single word. He maintained his perfect, terrifying control even in captivity. Mr. Thomas, after reviewing the Bar V, Eliza's diary, and the testimony regarding Clara's catatonic state, sought out Silas. "Mr. Beaumont," Thomas said, his face grave, "Vance is a complete psychopath. He sees the world as messy and chaotic. His control is a manifestation of his extreme need for order. The women, they were not random victims. He picked women who were quiet, isolated, and, in his mind, vessels that could be emptied and filled with his silence." Thomas noted that in one of Elias's previous aliases, Edgar Vane, he had been an apprentice clockmaker. He didn't just stop the clocks, Mr. Beaumont. He saw the world as a broken, noisy machine that he had to stop and correct. He needed 10 victims. 10 is the foundation of his system, the ultimate point of order. He would have erased them all to achieve his private, perfect silence. The suspense shifted back to Elias himself. Why the sudden, complete silence after his arrest? Was he still exercising control? Mr. Thomas believed Elias's silence was a final, internal victory. He completed the 10, Mr. Beaumont. He considers the ritual finished. He's retreated into his own perfect silence. We won't get a word from him. Silas, however, saw another connection. He thought of Clara, slowly fighting her way back with the word loud. Silas asked Mr. Thomas for permission to visit Elias Vance in his jail cell. The sheriff reluctantly agreed, believing a confrontation might finally break the psychopath's composure. The jail cell was a small, cold stone room. Elias sat on his cot, facing the wall, his back perfectly straight. He didn't react when Silas entered. Silas stood in the cell door, staring at the man who had stolen his daughter's mind and killed 8 others. He didn't yell or threaten. He spoke in a strong, clear voice, flooding the small cell with the sound Elias hated most: truth and disorder. "She said it, Elias," Silas announced. "She said the word loud. You failed. Clara is coming back. Your silence is broken. Elias did not move. You left a stain on the floor of the bar V, Silas continued, pushing the boundary. A mess. You didn't clean it all up. You lost control on your wedding night. You couldn't even keep your own home tidy. You're a failure, Elias. You didn't finish the perfect 10. Sarah is screaming, Clara is talking, and your system is a messy, blood-stained disaster. Silas waited. Elias's back remained straight. The silence in the cell was heavy, suffocating. Silas felt the failure of his attempt. As he turned to leave, Elias finally moved. His body didn't shift, but his head tilted just a fraction towards Silas. His eyes were wide and fixed, the pupil dilated. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out. Not a word, but a long, low, screeching hiss, like the sound of metal scraping metal, a sound of perfect, agonizing mental friction. It was the sound of his perfect internal silence being shattered by the realization of his failure. Elias Vance had lost his control. The suspense had broken, not in a fight, but in the final crushing psychological truth. He was broken. The man who craved order was left with the ultimate disorder of his own defeat. Silas left the cell, shaken but victorious. Elias would never speak another word, a fate ironically sealed by the pursuit of his own perfect silence. The final chapter, however, was not Elias's. It was Clara's. Elias Vance was transported out of Fort Willow by the territorial authorities, sealed into his silent final madness. The community breathed a collective, ragged sigh of relief, but the shadow of the Bar V and the chilling reality of psychological terror lingered. The true focus remained on Clara. She was speaking, but only that one word. Loud. She was trapped, acknowledging the existence of the world but unable to re-enter it. She was still fighting the terror that Elias had meticulously engineered. Silas realized that simply flooding her with noise wasn't enough. He had to address the core of the psychological trauma, the deliberate elimination of her identity, and the fear of the outside world. He brought in Martha and the two women who had survived similar psychological attacks from Elias's past aliases, Mary Jenkins and Sarah Jedediah, both now recovering under Doc Evans's care. The three survivors sat in Clara's room, a united front against the silence. Mary, still fragile, spoke first, her voice a reedy whisper. He told me the sun was a lie, that the light was too hard to look at, that the dark was kind. Sarah, still prone to panic, added, he said if I left the crevice, the wind would tear my skin away, that the outside was danger. Clara remained still, but her fingers twitched when Sarah said the word, danger. Silas took his daughter's hand. Clara, look at the window, he said gently, pointing to the window where the curtains were now wide open, letting in the full, hot light of the Wyoming sun. Elias told Eliza that the sky was dangerous. He wanted you to look at the wall, to look only at the dark. He knelt beside her. But you are Clara, the ranch girl. You were raised on the prairie. You know the sky isn't dangerous. You know it means life. He talked not about chaos, but about her identity and her agency, the things Elias had sought to erase. He reminded her of the hard, real work of the ranch, the feel of the rope, the smell of the leather, the power of a horse beneath her. He spoke of her favorite loud blue cotton dress, the color of the sky. He took your locket, Clara, Silas said, placing the silver piece back in her hand. He wanted you to forget who you are. But you are a Beaumont. You are stronger than stone and darker than any silence he could build. As Silas spoke, the sun, which had been bright, was suddenly blocked by a massive, rolling bank of dark grey clouds. A clap of thunder boomed, shaking the small house. It was a fierce, messy, disruptive prairie storm, the kind of sudden, beautiful disorder Elias hated. Mary and Sarah flinched, but Silas held Clara's hand firm. "This is the world, Clara," Silas said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It is loud. It is messy, but it is real, and you are here to be part of it. Clara looked up at the window, not flinching at the thunder, but gazing at the spectacle of the wild, untamed weather. Her eyes, which had been blank, slowly began to fill with the blue of the summer sky she remembered. And then she moved. Her head turned away from the window, and she looked directly at Silas, her father. She lifted her hand, not to cover her ears against the noise, but to touch the silver locket. She opened her mouth, and a second, stronger word emerged, her voice still rough but clear. Sky. It was a return. It was a declaration of defiance against the man who had preached the terror of the outside. She was acknowledging the world, the light, the life. She was Clara again. Her recovery was long, aided by the shared strength of Mary and Sarah, the only people who truly understood the subtle horror she had faced. The three women, connected by a shared nightmare and a unique resilience, went on to testify against Elias Vance, providing the comprehensive psychological evidence needed to ensure his complete and utter removal from society. The Bar V Ranch was ultimately abandoned, an empty monument to a failed obsession. The house itself, now known as the Silent Place, was a constant, chilling reminder that the greatest terror is not found in ghosts, but in the meticulous, controlled cruelty of the human mind. Clara never fully escaped the shadow of the silence. She remained quieter, more watchful, carrying a profound understanding of the darkness that lay beneath the veneer of order. But she did not retreat. She returned to the ranch, to the loud, messy life of the prairie, a true survivor. The ranch girl had been stolen, but the woman who returned had fought the ultimate psychological battle and won, proving that the will to live and the support of others could conquer even the most perfectly engineered terror.